the British Indian Territory and joined the British missionaries in the Danish colony of Serampore. One of his first contributions was to start schools for impoverished children, where they were taught reading and writing and Christianity. He opened the first theological university in Serampore, India, which offered divinity degrees and campaigned to the end to the practice of sati, which is the live burning of a wife along with her husband at his funeral. He wrote a book, some call it an essay, which is called An Inquiry into the Obligations of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of Heathens. And this led to the founding of the Baptist Missionary Society. He translated the Hindu classic, the Ramayana, into English, and the Bible into Bengali, Oriya, Assamese, Marathi, Hindi, and Sanskrit. He was the oldest of 5 children, and he was born to Edmund and Elizabeth Carey, who were weavers by trade in the village of Pollersbury, Northamptonshire. William was raised in the Church of England. His father was the parish clerk and the village schoolmaster. He had a nickname of Columbus, which was given to him by his friends because he loved to read and talk about traveling the world. As a child, he was naturally inquisitive and keenly interested in the natural sciences. At 11, he found a book on botany and was curious about that language in the book. His father told him that it was Latin, and he found him a dusty Latin book from his schoolhouse. In a few months of learning with the dusty Latin book, at 11, he learned Latin in a conversational way. Of course, he was having the conversations with himself. And he used this information to explore his love of botany. The plant you see above is actually, I'm going to slaughter this, but it's the Carey, I got that part, arborea. John, you probably can pronounce that properly. It's named after Carey himself. It's from India. So at 11, in 1772, he finished school and went to work as a farm laborer. He loved to be outdoors when working. He was small for his age, but he was a hard worker. Unfortunately, he developed an allergy to the sun and would have a painful rash on his hands and face while he was in the direct sun. This rash changed the course of his life. Had it not been for the rash, he might have stayed there forever. That sent him searching for a job, and he found himself as an apprentice to a cordwainer, which is a shoemaker, not a cobbler who fixes shoes. It's a much more complex trade. It could take 7 years as an apprentice to become a master. So he was 14 when he began this project, or this opportunity. He didn't go to be a weaver like his parents you would expect him to, but his dad had seen that weaving, because of the invention of the spinning jenny and other technologies, was not a lucrative. He didn't see a long term on that, so he suggested he take this opportunity. He knew someone. So he left his house and walked to his apprenticeship, where he was under the master Clark Nichols was his name. When he arrived, he was met at the door by another young apprentice named John Ward. And he would share a room with John. John had been there apprenticing for 3 years. As a cordwainer, one of his earliest responsibilities would be to go and gather materials and deliver products. He would have to walk many miles to do so. One Christmas, a blacksmith he was delivering to paid him 1 shilling as a tip, and also gave him the shilling that he was paying him for the goods he was delivering. He took his 2 shillings to the store, took his tip, of course, to buy a quill pen he had been wanting, and the storekeeper said that the coin was a worthless, counterfeit brass shilling. So he gave the shopkeeper the other shilling that was intended for payment for his delivered shoes. Then when he went to work, he gave his master, Mr. Nichols, the brass shilling, and immediately Mr. Nichols knew it wasn't real. He said, "This is a counterfeit." And then William said, "The blacksmith gave it to me." Well, the master immediately sent the other apprentice, John Ward, out to the blacksmith and demanded the real shilling. Meanwhile, William waited to see what would happen, knowing the truth of what had happened. he had swapped the coins. The offense for stealing a shilling was imprisonment, a public whipping, or being shipped off to the USA or India to work for 7 years. The punishment for stealing more than a shilling, by the way, was a public hanging. William prayed, "Father, if you get me out of this, I will never steal again. And I will go to church every Sunday.
Oh, yeah.
And I will pray 3 times a day." And he apologized and begged Mr. Nichols, "Please." Because when the blacksmith arrived, the blacksmith told the story, and it was very obvious what had happened. So not only did his conscience get him, his boss was very gracious and didn't send him to the magistrate. While he was working, he would sit there and tap at the shoes or tie with the shoes, and he was mixing that trade and continuing to learn. He would have a book open there, and he would be working through the books. He was a very smart 14-year-old. And when he was 15, he found a book written in a language he didn't know. This was Greek. And he wanted to learn more about the language, and Mr. Nichols suggested he take the book to a man who'd been at the local university, Thomas Jones. William met Mr. Jones, and Mr. Jones agreed to teach him about the language. And by the time he was 16, he could read and write Greek. And he learned this language in about a year and a half. So at this point, we've got Latin, Greek, what else do we have? There's Latin and Greek. English, obviously. 16. This is self-taught, pretty much. William kept his promise, since he had not been swept off to the West Indies for the brass shilling incident, and started to go to church 3 times, or pray 3 times each day and go to church on Sunday. He spoke about church with his apprentice, John Moore. They were very close friends. They spent a lot of time together. Obviously, they lived together. And they would debate religion. And that was because Carey's father was an Anglican clerk, but John's father was a leader in the nonconformist, or the dissenter church. William and John debated many subjects, and William would oftentimes win the debates, but secretly he envied John in his position as a dissenter. He had heard John's arguments and was beginning to be persuaded. One of the debates was about whether or not the cause of the American Revolution was right and just. And this position kept him from going to the and his newfound position, which was that it was just, kept him from going to the Anglican Church with a clear conscience. And he finally accepted John Moore's open invitation to the dissenters' service. During this service, he heard the reading of Hebrews from one of the members. He read Hebrews chapter 13:13. "Let us go, therefore, unto the camp, unto him without the camp," bearing his reproach. And this convicted him. And he realized this text tells him and tells us that we will be rejected by man in our place in life as Christians. And he was hit with this and realized that he really had no power or right to hold on to this lukewarm Anglican traditional faith that he had. And he felt at home with these dissenters to be outside the camp of the Anglican Church. And it was at this meeting that led William to follow Christ in a new and more alive way. And working together as apprentices, he and John Moore discussed their new common ground and continued meeting with the dissenters. Okay, I'm going to fly through many facts here. This is a big part of his life. It covers 1779 to 1784. His master, Nichols, passed away suddenly. So John and William both lost their jobs. And they both set out to find jobs. Well, William was taken to another apprenticeship where he joined another dissenter church. And in this church, he met Dolly, or Dorothy Plackett was her name, his future wife. And they married in 1781, just 2 years later. Dolly was 6 years older than William and couldn't read or write. They moved to a tiny, damp college, and within 1 year, they had their first daughter, Anne. William had also been invited to preach at the local dissenter church, and he had walked 8 miles to preach each time. And his parents had heard he was preaching. He would even go and see them after he preached, but they could never come and listen to him preach because his father would risk his job if he was caught attending a dissenter service. And when their daughter, unfortunately, was 18 months old, she became ill and died. William was also very sick, so sick he couldn't even attend her funeral. His mother came and watched over him but because of this sickness, he would never be the same. This sickness affected him the rest of his life. His fever was so high that he developed a bald spot at the age of 23. And he began to wear a wig whenever he would preach. Dolly was impacted severely to a state of shock and the loss of their daughter, and she'd lost the sparkle in her eyes. She would never be the same. It took 2 weeks for William to get back to work, and they needed income. Their friends and neighbors had given them enough money to buy a tiny cottage. It was higher on a hill and not as damp. Dolly and William hoped for a fresh new start here. But they were always haunted with the loss of Anne. In 1783, he was eventually convinced by the dissenters and by the Bible, of course, to become baptized as an adult. He had been baptized as a child, but he wanted to be baptized as an adult. And 3 months after his baptism, his new employer and now brother-in-law, Thomas Old, died. William took over that business, along with the responsibility of supporting Mrs. Old and their 4 children. So he's 23 years old. He's running a business. He's supporting his wife, Mrs. Old, as well, her four children, and preaching at the local dissenter churches. In 1785, his circumstances got a bit better. His sister-in-law remarried, so that removed the burden of supporting her and 4 children. A tiny church invited them to be their preacher, and they were able to pay him a little more than his current situation. He rebuilt that congregation, and it had dwindled over the past 10 years as it hadn't been with a pastor. And the local schoolmaster left, and a teaching opportunity opened up. So he became the local schoolmaster. And he enjoyed teaching the children, especially geography. He built a map out of the world using leather from the shop. He used a book that he had about Captain James Cook and his explorations. And not only did the children enjoy it, he also was moved by the subject and dreamed of giving the gospel to all of these nations. The old schoolmaster that had left returned, and William lost his job. I think he actually lost all of his students overnight. It wasn't that he was replaced, but the old schoolmaster was loved by the students, so he just didn't show up the next day. Well, he had to return to shoemaking full-time to supplement his income, along with preaching. In total, he would make an 11-mile round trip with his new job, and they still barely had enough money for their family. On May the 3rd, 1787, William Carey officially became a Baptist minister. The 3 ministers who conducted his service were John Sutcliffe, John Ryland, who was the man who baptized him, and Andrew Fuller. These men met for the first time as a group on this day, but they would become close friends from this day on. William began to debate many of his ministry colleagues about mission work. Many of them at the time believed that when the 12 disciples had died, the call to go and give the gospel to all the nations had gone with them, that it had ceased. They said that if God wanted to save the heathen, then God would do it himself. Carey argued that the Great Commission was to the church, not just to the disciples. And they called him a miserable enthusiast for even considering the position. This encouraged him to study and begin to write a manuscript that I mentioned earlier. It's called the Inquiry. That's the short name for it. This was put together to defend his position on the missions. Meanwhile, his employer, Mr. Gotch, had heard from his pastor, who was Andrew Fuller, how great a pastor William was turning out to be. This inspired Mr. Gotch to personally pay him 10 shillings a week to go home and study to become a better minister. This was as much as he was making shoes. So Mr. Gotch, his employer, decided, I'll just outright pay him to go home and study to be a pastor. He couldn't be happier. And this time, he used this time to learn 2 new languages, Hebrew and Dutch, to add to the Latin, the Greek, and the English. In 1789, he accepted an invitation to pastor a larger church, Harvey Baptist Church in Leicester. Maybe that's not pronounced correctly, I'm not sure, but that's how I'll pronounce it. They had 3 boys, and Dolly was expecting another child. I'm saying at this time they had 3 boys. I skipped that earlier, sorry. They could hardly fit into the small cottage that they had provided. And he began to teach school again to try and supplement their income. He taught from 9 to 5 every day and had a strict schedule when at home afterwards. He was a stickler for time management and stuck to a very strict schedule to keep up with this responsibility. Added to the responsibilities, he was also a secretary of the Committee of Dissenters, which included involving preaching and attending ministerial meetings. Their next baby was born, and her name was Lucy. And she reminded them of Anne, their first daughter who had died. Tragically, again, at 18 months, she too became ill and died. Dolly was thrown even more into deep, deep depression. Thankfully, Dolly's younger sister, Kitty, stepped down and helped her with the boys. Despite the tragedy and this busy schedule, William couldn't turn off this desire to deliver the gospel to all the nations. He kept improving his manuscript that he wanted to deliver to the Church of England. And in 1791, he met a man named Tom Potts. This was while attending a minister's meeting. Tom and William were discussing the horrible slave trade in America, and they began to discuss the manuscript that William was working on. Tom said he would be happy to pay for the publication of the book, which is known today as the Inquiry. Its full and original, extremely long name, as was fashionable in this day, was An Inquiry into the Obligations of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of Heathens, in which the religious state of the different nations of the world, the success of former undertakings, and the practicability of further undertakings are considered. The Inquiry. The book was published in 1792. There were 5 chapters. Chapter 1, whether or not Christians are required to be missionaries. Chapter 2, the history of Christian missionaries and a history of the world. Chapter 3, everything known about the world at the time, including tables and charts and countries, along with statistics of their religions. He probably knew more about geography than anyone else in England at that time. Chapter 4, ways to preach the gospel in foreign lands. In Chapter 5, how to raise money to go to another country. If you haven't read The Inquiry, I would recommend it. It's a short read, and it's a good one. In the day that it was published, it was certainly the most exhaustive book on missionary work, and possibly one of the greatest books in England on history at this time. Specifically, Christian history. This is all I could find as an image from the pulpit there at the church he was preaching in. And it was from this pulpit that he had the chance to speak at a Baptist ministers' meeting. And he spoke for the need for ministers. Many in attendance had read his missionary manifesto, The Inquiry. And on this day, May 31st, 1792, at 10 o'clock in the morning, he read from Isaiah 54:1-2. Lengthen thy cords and strengthen thy stakes, for thou shalt break forth on the right hand and on the left, and thy seed shall inherit the Gentiles and make the desolate cities to be inhabited. As he saw this, he saw it as a challenge for missionary work and as a challenge for faith. There aren't many known copies of this sermon he preached. There aren't any known. And there were 2 main points in this sermon. The first point was expect great things from God. The second main point was attempt great things for God. You may have heard this quote. It's usually next to the picture of William Carey when you see a picture of him. His close friends were convinced, but the group wasn't convinced. There were 12 in the group. At the meeting the next day, they said the missionary venture was just too much for them. Carey seized his friend Fuller by the arm and was very distressed. And he wasn't a man of much emotion, but He knew the proverb to keep your mouth closed, but he spoke up and pleaded to him. And he heard, and he spoke up on his behalf as well. And at this, several men in attendance agreed, and they said, let us make plans to begin foreign missionaries. So there were 12 ministers in total, and of the 12, 3 were the close friends that I mentioned earlier, Fuller, Ryland, and Sutcliffe, John Sutcliffe. They started a new society. It was called the Particular Baptist Society for Propagating the Gospel, which is today known as the Baptist World Mission. One question remained. Who would be the first missionary? And where would they go? Carey received a letter from London from a John Thomas who had gone to India many times as a doctor. He would be on the ships as a doctor, and he became a Christian. So he decided to stay in India and try to spread the gospel. When he came back to London, he was seeking funding to be a full-time missionary. And he had heard about the Particular Baptist Society, and he sent a letter to William. They got together, and William was excited to have their first missionary to support. And Dr. Thomas pulled a letter from his pocket to read to him a portion of the letter from the Brahmins in India. Please send us preachers and translators in India. And this hit William to the core, and he realized with his gift and at that moment he needed to go to India. The society committed themselves to supporting Dr. Thomas. And Dr. Thomas asked if he could recruit someone as a companion to go with him. William Carey stood up and said to Thomas and the group, I will go. Andrew Fuller exclaimed, there is a gold mine of souls in India. And Carey said, I will go into the mine if you will hold the ropes for me. And each of the members of the society committed to support him until the day of their death, no matter what happened. The course of William Carey's life was set that day, and the plans were firm. They would leave in about 90 days, and they began to plan on that day. That concludes part 1. I'm going to ask you if you have any questions I might have answers for about his life. And I have 2 questions for you. Because a lot of you know a lot more about history than I do. I'm not a history person. What you get?
I really like that last part. I will go down and you will hold the rope. We can't all go into the mine, but we can hold the rope where we're at. And when you're at the part where he inherited the business, had his wife, the other lady, and the 4 kids at 23, I thought you were going to transition to the mission field. I was saying, then he realized he just had to get out of there.
Well, we're going to get to that. He did quickly, without his wife even in attendance, say, I'll go. Any other questions? I'll get to my question. And it is why did the church in England that day not think that the Great Commission was to the church? Does anyone know theologically why they thought that? I've looked. I do not know the answer.
Well, I wouldn't put it definitive as why, and of course, that was probably the sentiment of the group that he was with more than anything else. And it had a lot to do with what we would think of as hyper-Calvinism. The idea that, and it is a good question. If God has elected people to salvation, if you read Ephesians 1, for example, then, what's the purpose in that? And I haven't read his book, but you challenged me to do that. I need to. I've heard about it, but I haven't read it. That's good. I'm sure I can find it pretty cheap online.
It's an essay. It's free, I'm sure, online.
Reprinted or whatever.
If you will read it, I will hold the paper.
I just need an Amazon gift card, that's it. In any case, but I mean, if you read the title, it's God uses means. And I think perhaps some of it would be uncovered there, is that they didn't think about the fact that God actually uses means to accomplish it. I mean, Christ says he's going to build his church, and that's true. He is, but he also uses means to do it. it's the same concept which we'll address to somewhat degree Sunday on prayer. You know, why would we pray if God is sovereign and all things are, nothing is going to come to pass without His ordination? Well, He has ordained for us to pray. He's ordained us to go. And then finally, I'll say in Romans, Paul would talk about how will they hear without a preacher. And so biblically, it's there, but philosophically and practically, you can miss what Scripture is really teaching. And I think that a lot of them fell into that mold and actually even enunciated it just due to their understanding of
I really have no answer. I have people saying their comfort in life was what they used that to justify it. That's all I can find. But theologically, I don't know.
Okay, well, first going along with Pastor Wayne's answer, John Gill was a very prominent Baptist theologian who lived just before that time, and that would have been his attitude.
Guild with a D?
Yes, John Gill.
Not a D.
Gill.
Oh, Gill. Now he does explain in the book why we should go. But I'm just curious why the Church of England said.
There are other factors at work, particularly with the Church of England, and that was that in India in particular, India was not directly controlled by the British government. India was a commercial venture that was controlled by the British East India Company. And the East India Company was responsible for caring for the British interest there. And their primary motivation was financial, exactly. And
Yeah,
so-
I'll touch on that next week.
Okay, they did not want to disturb the religion of the native inhabitants because they thought that might be bad for business.
Yeah, they might ask for more money. Or money, sorry.
I think if you go back to the early church in England, like the 7th century and all that, they were sending missionaries out to the continent.
Yeah, they do mention we have enough people here. That was part of their argument.
But I think later on, as it developed, certainly by the 1700s, if you were a minister, you came from a pretty educated part of society. They had nothing but utter contempt for the vermin, which is what they considered that would be the language to use, the vermin of the lower classes. They simply wouldn't associate with them. And most of these guys spent their time having tea with the lady in the manor or whatever. So I guess the bigger question would be, when did that happen? Like during the Reformation under Edward VI and people like that who were godly, was there any concept of?
Yeah, it was a change
Yeah.
because he speaks in the book the history, and he gives the history up to that point. There's plenty of missionaries that he talks about. We mentioned Brainerd. We've already covered Brainerd, but during that time they just selfishly closed in.
What was also the establishment church, was the establishment of religion. That's what it is. And so I think that.
This is a question that my research has driven me to that, to try and get to the conclusion of that. And there was only one other question that we could probably wrap. I don't think anybody knows the answer to this. I cannot find it. What do you got?
I've got a notation here in Wikipedia. It says Carey's friend Andrew Fuller had previously written an influential pamphlet in 1781 titled "The Gospel Worthy of All Acceptation," answering the hyper-Calvinist belief then prevalent in the Baptist churches that all men were not responsible to believe in the gospel. It says at a ministers' meeting in 1787, Carey raised the question of whether it was the duty of all Christians to spread the gospel throughout the world. John Colette Ryan is said to have retorted, "Young man, sit down. When God pleases to convert the heathen, he will do it without your aid and mine." That seems to be the attitude at the time.
Who are you, right? The only other question I have is this sermon that he gave where he says, the sermon that was a turning point where he said to expect great things and attempt great things. It's known as the deathless sermon. And I can't figure out why. Just sparked my curiosity if anybody knows why it was called the deathless sermon. And you would think you could just Google that, but I got nothing. But it was known as the deathless sermon. I don't know if anybody might know what that.
I was going to say my church that I attended in Atlanta, we had our motto based upon that, and it was attempt something so great for God that it be doomed to failure unless God be in it. And we built it from the years.
I'll pick up not next week, but the following week, and try to cover what he did in 40 years in India.
I have one question. You know, the first slide, can you get the first slide? Where it shows William Carey? Yeah, I was wondering if there's two Jeremys, right?
Did you ever have a crazy fever?
Yes.
It's probably related. Well, both he and his daughter got it. It was very sad. You know, and I will mention this because I'll mention a little bit of it next week, but it's definitely worthy to mention his wife, Dolly. And I've read quite a bit about her. She's not going to be sung much about in the story at all. She's an unsung hero here, but she lost 2 children. And in the story, she'll continue to lose more. And she lost her mind, so she was insane and chained up. But he refused to let her go. He held on to her, and I'll tell more in the next one. But she certainly should be a part of this story. And that's everything I've got, so thank you.